very important elements. The first is this almost a paradox between the fact that recharge and infiltration are reduced due to concretization of surfaces. And on the other hand, in a lot of our cities, we have old sewerage lines. We have old mains, water supply mains, which leads to leakage, which in itself leads to a kind of an induced recharge. So the competition between infiltration, reduced infiltration, and induced recharge is something that we have really not looked at in many parts of urban India. Now this in itself leads to what I call as contaminant loading of the subsurface, whether it's soils, whether it's our aquifers, and whether the reasons are sanitation, sewerage, waste disposal, their improper coverage, and so on and so forth, is something that we need to deal with. So I think I'd like to start with these two main points and come, so at the expense of repeating a few slides, which I'll quickly go through. Mihir actually presented this. To me, what is important is the groundwater, groundwater remains a blind spot, but it's a blind spot despite the fact that 50% of water supply in urban India is groundwater. And I think that combination is really a problem that we are dealing with. Now, I'd like to present what Mihir presented as this 4 schema of the urban continuum in a slightly different way. If you look at this as a sort of process that happens over a couple of decades or even 3 decades, then much of our urban centers have actually organically developed from rural hinterlands. So that's what we call the core city, or the core part of the township. As the core grows, and whether it's groundwater dependent, whether it's surface water dependent, so the blue polygon is surface water, the red, the sort of blue and green dots are wells, which represent groundwater. So sources of supply, whether it's groundwater or surface water, tend to increase as demand grows. And as the core cities transits into sort of the new city, as I call it, you find that civic supplies, the formal civic supply, is not able to meet with the growing demand in the peripheral areas. And that's where groundwater extraction, groundwater development begins. Now, as you kind of go down this trajectory, you go from the new city to maybe the peri-urban sort of buffer zones of urban centers, you find that groundwater increases. Interestingly, I'd like to flag a very, very interesting proposition that's actually happening in the urban areas of India. I don't know about many towns, but in many towns and cities of Maharashtra, especially Pune, where I live, you don't get a civic water supply connection till your construction is in place. So if you're building a house, you have to manage water resources till your house is complete. Now, in much of these situations, it's going to be groundwater that people are going to access. And I kind of would like to draw from what Tushaar calls in his story of groundwater in India as a lender of the last resort. So even for the rich in urban areas who are constructing houses, even for builders, groundwater remains the lender of the last resort, because unless your house is complete, you don't get a connection, a formal connection. So that zone, that time zone, is where groundwater extraction happens. So effectively, groundwater extraction is happening in the time zone buffers and as well as the spatial zone buffers of urban centers. And that is what this urban groundwater pie is about. And I'm going to take a slice of this pie a little later on down the presentation, where you'll actually see what happens when you sort of cross-section this pie. But let me take you to the next phase. So as a city grows, we tend to bring water supply from farther and farther away. There's a great demand for surface water systems which are essentially outside the influence of the urban growth. But as Dr. Gosain just put it, it has enormous implications in river basin water resources. And I think as this growth happens, you'll also, there are two elements that I'd like to flag additionally here. One is you're getting into what we call as urban agglomeration. If you look at the 4th phase that Mihir described, which is agglomeration. I mean, if you look at Gurgaon and Delhi, if you look at Mumbai, Thane, if you look at Pune, Pimpri Chinchwad, if you look at Hyderabad, Secunderabad, these are classical cases of physical agglomeration of two urban centers. So in some ways, urban centers are fusing together. And I think that's where this entire schema is important. The second question is a complete ignorance of our natural recharge systems, of our natural recharge areas. So I think the most impactful of, the biggest impact in this urban groundwater blind spot is the deterioration and degradation of our natural recharge areas, which are seldom considered in urban planning. So the urban continuum, to me, which Mihir presented, is really a two-dimensional thing. You can look at deconstructing urban India, especially the groundwater part, in two ways. One is these stages represent a spatial distribution of towns and cities in India. Second, it adds a temporal dimension to any single growing urban settlement. It's going to pass through these four phases. And therefore, I'd like to now bring the discussion in the second part of my presentation to the fact that these stages of schema represent unique solutions or unique situations which require a certain set of solutions and which also kind of are tied to the varying degrees of dependence on the sources of water. So again, the four stages and their water sources need to be looked upon in terms of the hydrological or the eco-hydrological typology that Mihir presented. And I'm going to dwell a little bit about trying to embed this whole story into that context. Given the fact that urban groundwater dependence as a whole is likely to increase, and given the fact that there's an urban-rural continuum that all of us acknowledge, I think we must look at this story in the context of the extremely diverse hydrogeological typology of India. This is a very, very generalized map of this diversity. We've brought it down to a very simplified set of sort of hydrogeological settings. And I'm going to take you through very quickly through what each of these settings looks like. So we'll begin with the sort of mountain aquifers or the mountain settings, the Himalayan mountain settings, which represents the mountain region of the Himalayas. We've tried to broadly come up with a distribution of differentially sized urban settlements in the mountain sort of hydrogeological system. And you can see the statistics at the sort of below there. So largely it is about small towns and maybe smaller cities in the growth path. It's about the continuum across micro watersheds or watersheds. It's about the continuum between the rural and urban. It's about the continuum between sanitation on one side and water supply on the other. So the Himalayan mountain region represents a very, very specific region in which groundwater and urbanization are embedded. I would go to the extent that we've done some very, very, very crude mapping of springs as a source of water supply. Almost 60 to 70% of the population in this Himalayan region depends on springs for its formal and informal water supply. So it has a very, very different context and it represents a very different situation from the extensive alluvial system in the Indo-Gangetic plains, largely in the Indo-Gangetic plains, which goes from extreme exploitation on the western side in Punjab, Haryana, to the sort of relatively unexplored terrain in Bihar and some parts of West Bengal. Here, because this forms a very large geographical area, you'll find that you get everything from small-sized towns to large urban agglomerations. And you're looking at extensive systems, extensive alluvial systems, which come with a very different set of problems as compared to the mountain regions. So issues as serious as arsenic, uranium contamination in some parts of Punjab, and then, of course, the access itself, the limited access to the very poor people living in the floodplains of North Bihar. Central West India, one of the most majestic volcanic provinces in the world, almost a geological heritage site. Again, a large area, differentially spaced towns. And I'll sort of go to the next slide immediately, which is just to give you a sense of what is happening in the city of Pune. I talked about the slice of the pie. So this is a slice of the urban pie in Pune city. And it looks at basalt aquifers. The core city is the brown arrows in the middle. Then you have the second stage, which is the growth and expansion. And then you get into the stage of agglomeration, which is the saffron arrow on top. Interestingly, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that in the core city of Pune, water levels in the shallow aquifers have risen. In the shallow aquifers along the eastern fringes, where there's actually accelerated growth, because that's where Pune city is reasonably open, shallow aquifers have shown a decline. In the western part, bordered by the Western Ghats, so in some ways bordered by almost a natural boundary to so-called rapid urban development, the shallow aquifers remain in equilibrium. The deeper aquifers in all these areas have undergone a decline. So this almost represents the complex situation in which one needs to look at groundwater, and therefore even within a city, the strategies, the different kinds of strategies that one might need to come up with to manage groundwater in urban India. The crystalline systems in large parts of peninsular India, again, a large hydrogeological setting, differently sized cities, and the cartoon actually tries to show you what is happening. Let me give you another example in this. We are doing a small study in the southeastern part of Bangalore in trying to experiment if participatory data collection is possible, because one can't really go through a very conventional study-based mechanism. And through this participatory mechanism, we've been able to construct some kind of an aquifer systems map, which gives us three very important lessons. One is 20 years ago, when this part of Bangalore was probably more rural than urban, much of the groundwater use was from shallow aquifers. Say about within the top 50, 60 meters, feet, the scale is in feet, sorry. 5 to 10 years ago, because the shallow aquifers depleted, people started drawing and putting their tube wells or putting their bore wells to about 500, 600 feet. And in the last 2 years, we've seen these bore wells go down to 1,300 feet. That's where the water is coming from. So I think the expansion, the spatial expansion, also has a third dimension, which is the depth of aquifers. So I'm just trying to kind of bring out the diversity in these conditions. Finally, I think there's one more. The consolidated sedimentary aquifers in central India pose a very different dimension. I mean, if you go to places like Hazaribagh or some of the places in Jharkhand and Bihar, the small towns that are growing into big cities, they're actually competing with water that's taken up by the mining industry. So mining and quarrying become a very different challenge when you look at groundwater security for urban centers in these regions. Finally, a bit of a question mark, and you'll see that they have put 4 question marks there, about transition areas. The Tarai region at the foothills of the Himalayas and at the northern fringe of the Indo-Gangetic plains also are home to thousands of small towns growing out of the rural hinterland. And this represents almost a diverse eco-hydrogeological setting of the Himalayas on one side and the vast expanse of the Indo-Gangetic alluvium on the other. Now, this is where a very different set of challenges are going to come about in the urban growth. So, having said that, I've also, last evening, I've tried to kind of reform or revise this typology of urban aquifers in India. And as you will see, as a slight difference from what Mihir presented, I have brought Delhi and Gurgaon in the transition zones. Simply because I think Chetan Agarwal here raised a point about this whole question of the Aravalli-Delhi ridge which passes through the region. And to me, rather than Delhi and Gurgaon representing a classical setting in the alluvial, almost the unlimited groundwater and water that we get in the alluvial plains, the connection to recharge to groundwater coming, part of it at least, coming from the Delhi and Aravalli ranges, which almost form an eco-hydrological niche for groundwater recharge and recharge security,